and I am remembering to record today, which is good. That one recording, I was so irritated because I did watch the first 10 minutes of it. Because it acted funny when I downloaded it. So I watched like the first 10 minutes and I was like, okay, cool, this is working fine. And then I closed out because I was like, it should have, like, I think I would have like seen something happen within the first few minutes, because usually I do. Nope, 21 minutes in, then it messes up.
Because I was watching through it afterwards.
Yep. Yeah. I was
Really
irritated.
it,
It's like the one that I actually did watch part of, the one that messed up. Yesterday we started Greece. Today we're going to have to finish it, which means we gotta go fast and skip a lot of stuff. But a little recap before we get started. Yesterday we began with the geometric era of art. Can anyone name like the main characteristics of that one? Shapes. Yeah. Then following that, we went over orientalizing art. Orientalizing art is marked with an increase in what?
Detail of
I'm gonna give
sculpture.
Jess this Kleenex box, and in return, she's gonna give me something. An increase in what? Trading, yes.
Oh.
It is a byproduct of trade. I'm not giving you that Kleenex box. I like it. It's got Kleenexes in it, which I occasionally need. The next one was Daedalic art. It's kind of your transition between Oriental and Archaic. It's not going to be on any test, but it's there. And then that takes us into Archaic art. Does anyone remember some of the characteristics of Archaic art? If you can't remember, there's one on the screen right now.
Sculpture.
Except for with Drace, because I forgot to share.
Male sculpture.
Nude males, yeah.
Yeah.
Following Egyptian formulas with poses, yeah.
A little bit more realistic.
A little more realistic towards the end, definitely. He's on the screen.
Tradition. Hasn't it? What?
The smile.
Yeah.
Oh.
The smile. So this is our last, well, kind of semi-last piece of Archaic art. This is from the western pediment of this temple, the Temple of Apphia, which kind of exists today in pieces. Each end had its own pediment. The original pediment was placed in 490 BCE. However, the eastern pediment had to be replaced in 480 BCE, so 10 years later. This is the original, the OG. Dying warrior from the western pediment. He is done in the very traditional Archaic style. He's got an arrow in his chest and he's happy about it. Now, as I mentioned, the eastern pediment was replaced 10 years later. When they replaced it, they didn't copy the exact style. They switched it up. So this is the Dying Warrior from the eastern pediment, done towards the very end of the Archaic period. And you can kind of see a shift here into the early classical style, which was obviously a lot more natural and realistic. This guy is not happy about dying. A big difference there. He also has some more muscular definition as well as a more natural pose. He's not super stiff looking. He looks like he could be a real person rather than a cartoon. Huh?
And the shield, right?
Yeah, he's got a shield that he is trying to hoist and hold himself up on rather than give up.
And that's just like that formula?
Yeah. And that does take us into the early and high classical periods, which are, of course, marked with a lot more naturalism. like one of the big characteristics for that one. It's also marked by the defeat of the Persians by the Greeks, and they use that triumphant victory to illustrate a lot of their art. So it's going to keep popping up. They were very proud of defeating the Persians, and the idea of teaming up together for the first time in history bolstered the Greeks' confidence in Hellas and nationality. Yay! Although that was rather short-lived, because during this period, Athens decided that they were going to be in charge of all of the state's funds for war. Meaning all of the states, like Sparta and Thebes, had to pay taxes to support future war efforts. Those taxes were paid to the Athenians, which, number one, made Athens feel like it was the seat of the government. Number two, it gave Athens a whole bunch of money and they did not use it for war. They used it for art. Good or bad, I don't know. I'm kind of happy about it because we got a lot of stuff from them thanks to it. Other city-states not happy. But yeah, there was a distinct difference at this point in history between Europe and Asia, thanks to the creation of this unified Hellenic state, and that characteristic still exists today. There is an obvious difference between Europe and Asia, thanks to this happening. And that really sparks the early classical period, which is, of course, the climax point in Greek art history and their history in general. So some of the things that change, architecture is obviously a big one. They improve upon their temple structures. The Temple of Zeus was one of the first great monument examples of classical architecture. Unfortunately, it no longer exists. It was located at Olympia, the seat of the Olympic Games, and it kind of really catered to illustrating and bolstering support for those games themselves. Like I said, it is kind of ruined now. The architect was Libon of Elis, in case you want to know who made it, but we're going to be talking about a lot of architects, and he is not the most important one. But yeah, it did look very similar to the second temple of Hera at Paestum, which, not that one. I think we're going to get to it today. Oh, here it is, duh. Next slide. It looked pretty similar to this one. So still your Doric style temple. It has the outer colonnade as well as the inner temple with more Doric columns. Inside of the inner temple would have been a giant statue of Zeus. Once again, it's not there anymore. But yeah. As I mentioned yesterday, the first temple of Hera was replaced by a second temple of Hera right next door to it. This is it. Is that second temple. It's pretty much the same, except they have definitely improved their columns. If we need a refresher on what it looked like, it was back quite a ways. Not that far, I must have skipped it. Nope. Here. So flat pancakes, fat columns, pretty like there's a lot more columns than there should be. And there was the colonnade down the center of the temple. They got rid of that for the second one. And they thinned out the columns. The Doric capitals are not quite as pancakey as they used to be. They're still pretty flat though. And of course, per the usual with temples, there are pediments. The pediment sculpture obviously improves from archaic to classical period. That is because of the introduction of more natural poses and the idea of contrapposta, which we'll talk about in a second. This particular pediment sculpture is what's left from the Temple of Zeus that no longer exists. If you're wondering what's going on in each of the pediments, like I mentioned, it was placed right in front of the Olympic Games, particularly the chariot ring. So they fit the sculpture with that theme. The east pediment sculpture, which faced that chariot ring, was a chariot race from mythology, not just any chariot race. It was a chariot race between Pelops and King Oenomaus. Oenomaus received a prophecy when his daughter was very young that should he ever let her marry, he was going to pretty much be doomed and he would die. So he set up this competition for any of her suitors that they had to beat him in a chariot race to win. But the thing is Oenomaus was using Mars's horses and chariots to win. So mythological horses. So no human charioteer could actually beat him. But Peplos comes along and bribes the groom that takes care of the horses and the chariot to rig the chariot to have an accident. So Oenomaus ends up actually dying on the racetrack as his chariot collapses, and Pelops wins the race. Now, Pelops was supposed to, like I said, he bribed the groom. He's supposed to pay the groom off. He never did it. Groom angry. Groom very angry. Groom curses Pelops. Pelops also has a ill fate. Yeah. It's not a good story, but it did fit the theme of the chariot racetrack that it faced. And this is kind of what's left of that. So you see 3 horses here. There would have originally been a chariot there. See, Kleenex, they're useful. Some more horses on the other side as well. Zeus, of course, was in the center there, because I mean, it's his time. Some more sculptures. This is a closer look at the eastern pediment. On the eastern pediment is the image of the seer being the guy that prophesies that if Oenomaus let his daughter marry, he'd die. This guy. What do you guys notice about this seer that's a little bit different from the archaic sculptures that we've looked at, just to hit it home?
Very decent, thick, so the
Well, that's because his arms broke off.
He's not as muscular. There's
Not
like he's not super fit.
Yeah,
He doesn't look like he has the classic smile.
he's not got a smile. He's not fit.
He's
He's not
worried.
young. They could have
Oh, he's not
illustrated
naked.
him as young. I mean, there's no set, this is what a seer looks like.
He's not nude.
He's not nude, no. So that's a big difference. So different choices were made here. Do you think they're good or bad? I guess it depends on your preference. Yeah. I mean, I think it's a big improvement. But if you don't like looking at old guys, probably not a good
That big
improvement.
shot.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because the
Mhm.
horsey
Yep.
of the chart.
He is, speaking of him being trapped, he is the only figure in that pediment that actually has a facial expression going on. The rest of them have no expression, which is a characteristic of classical art. In Greece, they chose to not show expressions, and we're going to talk about why in a second. Some more sculptures. This is from the Western pediment. This one shows Apollo as the central figure. He's battling the centaurs and the lapis, which is once again a common story with
That one,
Greek art.
real. Still existent.
This is what's left of it, yeah.
So
And of course, our final sculpture from this one, a closer look of Apollo. This one kind of characterizes that thing that I said earlier about expressions. He doesn't have an expression on his face. He's there. That's it. He's there. There's no thoughts, expression. Once again, he is a youthful male nude, which was a primary choice for illustrating gods as those idealized figures. But he's also in the pose of contrapposto, meaning there's a specific pose. Contrapposto is literally putting your weight on one leg. When you put your weight on one leg, like this guy is here, your hips go off kilter, which is exactly what happens ever so slightly. Your knees also don't line up, and your shoulders tend to go off center as well, because that's our body's way of balancing ourselves on one leg. So we have, in the classical era, people really studying the human form to see what happens when we do stuff, which began in the archaic era, but really progresses quite a bit during the classical. Don't click forward. Some more sculptures. We're not going to talk about this one, but this does illustrate. It's from the metapiece of the Temple of Zeus. It illustrates the 12 labors of Hercules was what those metapieces were focused on. Those 12 labors do pop up in Greek art and Roman art in the future. Maybe we should talk about it since this is the first mentioning of it and it keeps popping up in art history. So yeah, we will talk about it. Changed my mind because I'm like thinking it pops up like 2 more times in this chapter and the next chapter. So it saves us time to talk about it now. So the 12 labors of Hercules, in order for him to become a god, he's supposed to, well, besides becoming a god, he killed his wife and yeah. He's trying to regain his like status, basically. He goes through 12 labors, even though it was Hera that tricked him into killing his wife. Anyway, side note. And Hera is the one that is in charge of some of the labors. And in one of the labors, Hera asks Heracles or Hercules to get the golden apple back from, I think it was Athena that had it. Yeah, it was Athena that had it because this was after the Trojan War. Yeah, because that's real. Everything's real. I'm talking like it's real. But Hercules has to get the golden apple back from Aphrodite when she has been given the golden apple by Paris as the reward for being the most beautiful goddess. He has to get it back because Hera wants her apple back because it was hers originally. It was taken from her for that competition. Apollo can get it back easily because they're friends. But the thing is Apollo's kind of busy because he's got the world on his shoulder. Kind of his job. His other name's Atlas. He carries the world on his shoulders. So Hercules has to take over carrying the world on his shoulders for Apollo to go and get this apple back from Aphrodite. And yeah, this is Apollo coming back with the apple. Hercules is still holding the world on his shoulders. Athena comes and helps Hercules because she's like, I know you can't do this on your own. You're a person, not a god. She's helping with one hand, but he is busy there holding up the planet, and he is not worn out. And I'm mentioning that because some other versions show him a little bit worn out. Do you think, after holding up the entire world for a few hours while this dude gets an apple, you're going to be kind of tired? Just a little bit. Here, though, in our early classical version, he is not tired at all. He's just built different, yeah. He's just built a little different. He's just there, you know. Which goes back to the idea of like no expressions. Showing those idealized forms. They aren't concerned with emotions during the early classical period at all. They're more concerned with the human figure. Emotions are non-existent. That idea of taking away emotions has a name. It's called the severe style. Aptly named.
the severe style because there's no emotion. It's very severe. Some more statues, which is predominantly what this section is about. The Critias boy, which once again also abandons that stiff archaic posture in favor of contrapposto. That change itself did begin during the Archaic era when the Persians were still invading, and it does definitely take off afterwards when the original classical era, as it's dated, begins. Similar contrapposto, everyone really likes it. This one's cool. These are the Rias warriors. There's a group of them. The sculpture is unknown. They were found a while ago underwater by a bunch of divers, so they had to be restored because barnacles. Yeah, and this is them restored. They were made of bronze. There's some fun stuff here. Using the lost wax casting method. They would have originally had shields, spears, and helmets, which is why their heads look kind of funky because originally there were helmets on them. Now there's not. But the fun thing about them is they have silver eyes, teeth, and eyelashes. Their lips are made of copper and their nipples are copper too. Choices. Choices were made.
Cool.
Like I said, there's a group of them. More fun bronze sculptures because most early classical Greek sculptures were actually bronze, not marble. So that's just another fun little side note. Is the charioteer. The charioteer was also once part of a group. Now we just have him. He even had horses and an entire chariot as well as his groomsmen, a big group that he was part of. Now, however, like I said, we just have him. He is missing his arm. You can kind of see the reins that would have at one point been attached to his chariot in case you're wondering what it used to look like. It used to look like this. So it was big. It was a big one. This statue itself is 5'11", so it is life size. This entire group would have been life size. It was impressive. Most bronze statues that are this large would have had to have been made using the lost wax casting method, which is the idea of making a plaster cast, but plaster is not durable enough to heat up bronze in because it would melt it. And then using the plaster cast, fill it with beeswax or some other kind of wax to make kind of a wax mold, and then covering that wax mold in a clay silica combo and baking it. The wax melts out, leaving the area for the bronze to go into. So it's all about making molds in order to make these bronze sections. This bronze is hollow. Most of these, because they're so big, had to be made in parts. So there would have been multiple molds for multiple body parts. And then you put them back together at the end with some welding tools. Of course, back then welding was a lot different than it is today. But yeah, if you're more interested in lost wax casting, I think that your book has a little excerpt on it, and there's also really short videos online too, which are easier for me to comprehend because I don't do things well reading. I'm more of a visual person. But yeah, it would have originally been made in separate pieces. His posture is slightly more on the archaic side just because he is super stiff, but there is some, I would say, variation from that with his tunic, which does look like it would be like billowing at the top a little bit. His bottom, obviously not billowing, but that's because they weren't moving. If you go back to this picture, these horses are not moving. This is what illustrates the winner's circle after the race. His garment is hoisted up with ropes. Originally, this would not have been there. He would have had long flowing arms down the way, but when you're racing, that kind of gets in the way. So he's wrapped those up to hold the sleeves back. He is also kind of in the Severus style, but he almost looks like he has a little bit of an expression in comparison to some of the others that we've looked at, like Sirius. Kind of not super clear on that, but yeah.
Your book says severe style, but I say he looks kind of serious to me. But both of those things are the same word, so yeah. He also had individual eyelashes on, however, his were not copper or silver, his were also bronze. So great attention to detail with all of these bronze statues that we've talked about. And yeah. It's a shame we don't have this. I think it'd be so cool to see. And of course, our next one is the Artemisian Zeus, which is in the pose of holding a trident, thunderbolt, or spear. That's because we aren't sure if it's Zeus, Poseidon, or just an athlete. Depending on what he was holding, we would know. But once again, in the severe style, once again, bronze made using the lost wax casting method. However, this one has a very interesting pose. With this one, his weight is not on both feet at all. One of his heels is raised. So they have figured out to properly weight this metal in order to place a majority of it on this section and possibly on his toe in order to keep it balanced. And this is another one that was found in the water and had to be cleaned up and restored. Some more really, well, this one's really famous. This is the Discobolus by Myron. So we finally have an actual artist here for sculptures, Myron. The original bronze sculpture is lost. This is a Roman copy. Most Roman copies are done in marble. When Rome goes to Greece for the first time and eventually conquers it, they are fascinated with the Greeks' architecture and sculptures, and they end up making a bunch of copies of it because they want to own it. Kind of like prints are. It's a little bit cheaper and easier to own a copy than it is to own the original. So there were actually warehouses and manufacturing points that employed masses of artisans to make a bunch of copies of this for the wealthy Romans to purchase. So there's a lot of copies of this one. This is just one. He is an action statue, meaning he is doing something. The last one's technically also an action statue using the process of throwing. This one, very clearly an action pose, also a very dynamic pose. He's not just standing there, juxtaposed to the archaic posture of he's actually moving. There's technically two intersecting arcs that happen with his body as well. The first one from his back, the second one from his arms. So we have these two parallel arcs that meet and cross, creating and adding to that composition that's pretty awesome to look at.
The details are really,
Yeah.
really good.
Really realistic details.
Like from on the banging of my head.
Mm-hmm.
How did they figure out his copy?
With Roman copies, they put added supports on them because with bronze, you don't need supports. It's not as heavy. It's hollow inside. With marble, it's really heavy. So certain sections you have to add support structures to. So you can tell Roman copies by if there's a random stump or rock added in. Good question. Once again, in the severe style, even though he's in the process of probably throwing a discus at his Olympic Games, he has no expression on his face. His brows are not furrowed. He does not look like he is competing in anything. It looks like he's very casually throwing the discus, which is probably not true. Some more, this is Polyclitus' Doryphoros, or the spear bearer, another spear bearer. His spear is lost as well. This is another Roman copy to you with the stump in the background, you can tell. This is the one that really gains the credit for hitting home the idea of contrapposto because it is so extreme. This guy's really got his hip cocked out there in comparison to some of the others that were a little bit less pronounced. Polyclitus is also really famous for writing a book called the Canon. The Canon studies the perfect mathematical proportions of the human male body.
And the ratio is 1 to 7 or 1 to 8? 1 to 7. It's 1 to 7. So 1 to 7 is the ratio on how you determine things like head spacing, neck spacing, torso, and everything else. Yeah, math. It was literally math. He took measurements on real human figures, on a lot of real human figures, and studied what happened in different poses and illustrated them in a sketchbook, and then published that book called The Canon, that's its literal name, and sold a bunch of copies of it. Yep. So that's why he really gets like the award for the inventor of contrapposto, even though it technically already existed, because he helped spread and disseminate how to do it to the rest of Greece. So yeah, many influential philosophers come from this particular era of Greece. One of them is Pythagoras. I'm laughing. Polyclitus was one of Pythagoras's followers, which kind of makes sense. Polyclitus and Pythagoras felt like beauty resided in numerical ratios, and therefore, by that reasoning, the perfect statue can be built. It's recorded that Polyclitus tested this out by making 2 statues at the same time, one of them following his canon, which follows those mathematical ratios, the other one following the advice of people, random bystanders. And then he showed both of them at the same time and asked them which one looked better. Of course, people preferred the mathematically proportionate version versus the one in which he just took advice from people. The one that was advice looked hideous. Of course, this is all thanks to the recordings of Pliny the Elder. Pliny the Elder is the first art historian ever. He really is. He's the first art historian. He would go around to different cities and different cultures and record the art there and describe it for us and talk to the artists, like Polyclitus. He'll die later on in this story. Brandon knows. I talked to him because I was sad. But yeah, he'll die eventually. So, like I mentioned earlier, the Acropolis, after the Persians attack, Athens takes over all of the funds from the Delian League, which is what these city-states call each other when they're united. They're called the Delian League. I know it makes sense. Sounds super important though. When Athens takes control of all of the funds, the current leader of Athens, Pericles, decides to use those funds to rebuild the Acropolis, which was sacked and destroyed by the Persians during the war, which is totally what people in Sparta, Thebes, and Corinth intended their money to be used for, was to rebuild something in Athens. Definitely. Here's Pericles. This is what he looked like. This is just a portrait bust. He made a lot of portrait busts. This is from a full-sized body sculpture of him. This is just the head portion though. Oh, I did have it in here. It's from a nude full body sculpture of him. Funny enough, the Romans copied this idea of having leaders in full nude. They call it the heroic nudity. Yeah. So it was pretty common for any important ruler in Greece and Rome later on to show their leaders in full body nude and have them in idealized forms like the gods, goddesses, and heroes of mythology. But yeah, this is Pericles' head, what's left of it. We don't have his full body statue anymore. His full body statue was probably made by Chrysilas. And this portrait bust is, according to Pliny's descriptions, the one that looked most like the actual head of the full body, because there were a lot of different versions made.
as is what happens when you have Chinese telephone. But yeah, so like I said, he commissioned a bunch of artists and architects to rebuild the Acropolis using the Delian League's funds. Good or bad, I don't know. Most people were angry. But the Acropolis does consist of several buildings, and the period of building them was done over a long swath of time. It was not all done at once. So with these buildings, there are different trends happening in art and architecture. We are going to be spending a lot of time now on the Acropolis and going through the different buildings and talking about the different architectural features, which, as I mentioned yesterday, I don't like architecture. So yeah. Anyways, so for this, you wouldn't go up to the Acropolis for just anything. You would go up there for special occasions or to give offerings to the goddess Athena. There's some other gods in there too, as well as some of the first kings of Athens are buried there. And we'll get to that in a second. You'd walk up the hill through, you would most likely stop at the temple Athena Nike, which we'll look at. You would walk through the Propylae. The Propylae had a center opening for chariots and side openings for people to walk through. Yeah. We'll talk about that one too. And then you would go into the central market area where those chariots would unload their goods and sell them for festivals. And you have your Propylae, which is an interesting building, which we're going to talk about quite a bit later on, as well as the Erectrion, which is another very interesting building that we'll talk about later. And then, of course, the main jewel is this building back here, which we'll talk about in a second. Probably you guys already know what it is, in which the major statue of Athena would be housed. There would also be a small wooden statue of Athena, which people changed the robes on every year for this festival and gave offerings to in the back where people could actually go. Building by building, yeah. Building by building. Come on. With me, please. Okay, starting with the big one, the Parthenon, which, like I said, has the statue of Athena. It has an outer colonnade on it. Of course, you walk up steps to get into it. The steps go all around all four sides of the Parthenon. Of course, the main entrance is at the front. On the back side is where the smaller temple of the wooden statue was housed. So if you remember our format, this is the generic temple plan. The Parthenon also follows that generic temple plan. You have your outer colonnade, your inner temple, your back room where that wooden statue is housed, where you actually gave offerings and money. And then the inner temple with the really, really large statue. Of course, this is what's actually left of the Parthenon today. Not much, but yeah. It also follows a mathematical formula, and this mathematical formula is used on most temples following this point. And that formula is x equals 2y plus 1. Yeah. So your short end on this particular temple has 8 columns, therefore 2 times 8 plus 1 equals 17. That means your long end should have 17. Yeah. And the rest of the temple pretty much follows that, except there are some slight deviations because life. Such as there is a smaller opening in certain areas because they felt like if you were looking at it and staring at it long enough, our human eye makes it look even. Therefore, you have to change up the spacing sometimes in order for it to appear even though it's not technically even when you are staring up at it. So these two are spaced differently from these two, even though they're trying to follow a mathematical formula. But if looking at it, you might think they're exactly the same. They're slightly off though. Same with the actual column shafts. They go in which is not the norm. You want them normally to be exactly straight down. However, when you're from the ground looking up, it looks like they're straight. That's because they were working on that viewpoint. Looking up was the viewpoint at that time, and they wanted everything to look the same from that viewpoint. Of course, now that we have measurement systems and can see different viewpoints, we know better. So there are some slight deviations, but most of those deviations have to do with them trying to give the appearance of sameness and symmetry, even though it's not. But yeah, so as I said, here's the interior, one of them here, 9x4. 9x4 is the usual ratio for the column width as well as the spacing in between them. It's also the proportion of the building itself is the 9x4. And of course, inside was the, at one point, a very large statue of Athena. This is a model from Nashville. If you ever want to see the Parthenon, go to Nashville. There's an exact replica of it before it was broken. This is inside of it. We don't have any of the original statue. But this is what the original statue is described to have looked like at one point. It was originally 38 feet tall. The replica is 38 feet tall. It was made of gold and ivory. In one hand, she holds a Nike. Nikes are symbols of victory. Athena, of course, the goddess of war and wisdom. So victory, kind of her thing. Nikes are literally like angels. They look like angels. There are representations of I can never say this. Centauromachy on her sandals. Here's a close-up of her sandals. Yes, it is impressive. There's stuff all over this. So on her sandals is the story of the Lapis and the Centaurs. It gets better though. On her shield, on the outside, is the story from mythology of the Greeks battling the Amazons. And on the inside of the shield is the battle between the giants. Yeah, the battle between the giants on the inside was originally painted. It's cool. Not to mention that at the bottom, there's also a pedestal that illustrates some stories from mythology. So there's a lot going on this. And it's gone. We don't have it anymore. Some things that we do actually have from the Parthenon left, we have some fragments of the metopes. The metopes on Doric temples are those areas right in between the triglyphs. This section of metopes also illustrates the battle between the Lapis and the Centaurs, which we talked about yesterday, so I'm not going to retell that story. There are 92 metopes in total. They would have originally been painted, although by painted, I mean the background was red and the figures themselves were white. The red was used to really make them stand out, so you could see them all the way from the ground. As you might notice as well, some portions are completely broken off. That's because they were entirely in the round. So portions of this are very high relief, and then other portions are in the round, meaning they aren't attached to a background at all, such as this guy's head, his foot, his arm, this guy's head. They aren't attached to a background at all. Here's some more from those scenes. If you want to see these broken pieces of the Parthenon, go to England. They are located in the British Museum. There is nothing in Greece, don't go there. Well, I mean, this is there, but you can't go in it. So I don't know, your preference, I suppose. Some of the pediments of the Parthenon, the east pediment shows the birth of Athena. She was born out of Zeus's head. He had a really bad headache. I'm not joking, that's how the story goes. He had a really bad headache, and so I think it was Mars operates on him and cuts his head open, lobotomy, and out of that is born Athena. Yeah. And this is a replica. This is not what it looks like today. This is what's left, but this is what it actually looked like. So here we have Zeus, Athena, one of the Nikes. Poseidon, of course, is pretty recognizable. Hera over here. As well as a bunch of the other gods and goddesses. The fun thing that I like though is Helios. So over on this side, for those that don't know, Helios is the god that moves the sun across the sky. That's his job. He pulls it with his chariot of 4 horses. So over on the left side here, Helios and his horses are ready to go. The day is starting. And then over on the other side, Helios has just finished his job. His horses are exhausted. And we still have some of the horses. See, this dude's tongue sticking out. He is overworked. And that is from the end of the day. So it's kind of interesting that they have the illustration of the beginning of the day and the end of the day from left to right in the story. And like I said, this is what's left. Not much. On the other side, also not much left. The Western pediment shows a battle over at, well, not really battle. So 2 gods slash goddess claimed Athens as theirs when it was first formed. Those 2 were Athena and Poseidon. I'm sure you can tell who won already. But this illustrates them competing over Athens. Poseidon, which you can kind of tell under here, gifts Athens with a well of fresh water right next to the ocean. Literally like puts his trident in the ground and a well springs forth. Athena gifts them an olive tree. So go with Athena. I'm pretty sure you knew that already though. But yeah, this is what's left of that one. So there's less left of that one. Who remembers why there's not much left?
They get destroyed.
Yeah, it got ruined.
Yeah.
So huh? It was when Turkey was trying to invade and take over Greece. They seized control of the Acropolis and they housed their armaments slash gunpowder in the Parthenon. And it caught fire and boom. That's why there's no roof. It was blown off. But yeah. There are some pieces of the Ionic frieze. Remember, I mentioned this is a Doric temple. Well, they decided to do something different with the inner temple here. They made it Ionic. So there is a combination of the archaic tradition of Doric and the more popular during the High Classical period Ionic style temple happening with most of the Acropolis buildings. The inner portion of the Acropolis does have an Ionic colonnade going on, and of course with Ionic columns come continuous friezes instead of metopes. And the continuous frieze on the inner Ionic colonnade portion shows a procession to the Acropolis. This procession was one that actually happened every single year, once again, to change the garments of the wooden statue of Athena. But yes, this is a detail of what's called the Panathenaic procession. Obviously not a high relief like the metopes were. This is a low relief. They are less than halfway sticking out. But yeah, this is what that is. And the frieze illustrates the beginnings of the procession at the Diplon Cemetery's gate all the way up to the Acropolis. This is towards the beginning of it. The leaders of the parade were young men on horseback leading the way. There's some more images from that Panathenaic procession. We do have some females being shown, I believe somewhere along the line. Yeah, women. Because this is a festival, women are allowed out of the house. Woo. And this is actually the women preparing to get the garment together to reclose that wooden statue here. Some more from that frieze. We do have a good chunk of this one. I mean, it's not perfect, but it's more than the others. And of course, that takes us to another building in the Acropolis, the Propylaea. Depending on how you spell it, it's with an I or an E. I don't really care. It is your entrance to the Acropolis. This is the one that I mentioned. It has an entrance for chariots as well as an entrance for people to walk. So it does not have evenly spaced columns because chariots are wider. They had to leave a space large enough for chariots to travel through with a ramp leading up to it. And then on each side are stairs for people walking to use. There's a lot going on in the Propylaea than just a passageway, though. By the way, it is Doric style from when it was made. It was built by the architect Mensicles, in case you want to know who made it. It is not finished. It was supposed to be even on each side, as you can see here, though. The north wing and the Pinacote and the south wing are not even because it didn't get finished over here. Never done. This, though, on the north wing ends up becoming an art gallery, and it's quite possibly the first art gallery ever for public consumption rather than private. Moving on to, unless I have a picture of it. Oh yeah, this is what's left of it. So you can kind of see the large ramp is still there and the large doorway for the chariot, as well as the smaller doorways for people to walk through. Next temple, though, is the Erechtheion. The Erechtheion was where the wooden statue of Athena was later housed, as well as some of the tombs of the first kings of Athens. And it honored some other gods and goddesses. It was designed asymmetrically. It is the only building in the Parthenon or Acropolis complex that was purposefully asymmetrical. The others just weren't finished. Well, the last one was just not finished. It is intentionally built on unlevel ground because of what it contains. It contains and is built around the well that Poseidon made, supposedly, and the olive tree that Athena gifted them, supposedly. So the architects had to design around these mythological things. Therefore, you're working with what you got as far as space. It's also on a hillside. And since it is holy sacred ground, they aren't allowed to make things even and change stuff. Therefore, we have an asymmetrical, uneven level building. This is all on multiple levels. On one side, you have the caryatid section, which we're going to talk about in a second. On the other side, there are no caryatids. Obviously, this is not symmetrical at all. Here's an aerial view just to give you an idea of how unsymmetrical it is. Here's that caryatid porch closer up. The north porch, which held the tomb of Erechtheus. Erechtheus was one of the first kings of Athens. The sacred olive tree is out in front of, well, actually it's in behind, sorry, I'm looking in the wrong one. So here's the front of your temple. You enter into the east side, one of the altars to one of the gods, the sanctuary of Athena Polias, where that wooden statue was kept. The saltwater well and olive tree are in a courtyard in behind. So your saltwater wells here, your sacred olive trees here, caryatid porch over here, one of the tombs here, and there's another tomb over, it's not marked, it's back here, to one of the other kings of Athens. Here's your caryatid closer up. You have dentils, and of course, instead of columns, you have these lovely ladies supporting the porch with their heads. And they are in contrapposto pose. However, their body is still very even like archaics because they're having to act as support. You can't have that off-kilter stance with natural contrapposto. Luckily, though, their garments kind of hide that portion of things. Now, another temple in the Acropolis, like I mentioned, we're spending a lot of time in the Acropolis, was the Temple of Athena Nike, which has friezes depicting the battle at Marathon against the Persians. as well as a bunch of Nikes housed inside, which is why it's called the Temple of Athena Nike. It was the first temple that you would approach on your way to the Acropolis. And here's one of those Nikes. And now we are moving on to some other stuff outside of the Acropolis. This is the Hegeso stele. Frequently, wealthier members of families would have steles made to act as grave markers. Remember, they still cremate. Other people also continue to use vases to mark things, but this is a little variation as a grave marker, which is kind of more common to what we use as a grave marker, a large stone. On this is illustrated Hegeso, the daughter of Proxenos, with her maidservant. And this has nothing to do with Hegeso, it has to do with Proxenos, even though it marks Hegeso's grave. This is all about Proxenos showing off his wealth and ability. So not only was Proxenos able to purchase a stele to be made, he was also able to purchase his daughter a slave and jewelry. This is all about Proxenos. It has nothing to do with Hegeso, even though it's for her. It is in an interior setting, which makes sense because women like Hegeso would not have been allowed outside normally. There are very serene facial expressions here, not really any emotions going on. And we do have interaction here with a live person and a dead person, Hegeso being dead, slave being alive. We would hope. We're going to see more interactions with living and dead later on from the Greeks. This is just the first one, which is why I mentioned it. Moving on to painting. Painting did exist in ancient Greece. However, they painted on wood. Wood does not last. So the examples of painting that we do have are usually vase type paintings. Beginning with the Achilles painter here, who uses the white ground technique, meaning it's white. It's Achilles. He is going off, well, I mean, it's called the Achilles painter, but it has to do with a warrior. This warrior is going off and saying goodbye to his wife. Possibly for the last time. This could have possibly been a grave marker. On to some more interesting wares. Polygnotos, leading painter of one of the times, he was known for introducing compositional formats into painting, which ends up carrying over into pottery and mosaics as well, meaning he actually designed the layout rather than having people just on a flat ground. He had multi-levels. He had a foreground, a background, even added in some foliage. First one to do that in ancient Greece. So we have foliage here in the background. This is an example of what people thought his panels might look like today because we have descriptions. Foregrounds, midground, background. This is new. This has not happened before. Meaning that the Greeks did actually understand how to illustrate things like depth in two-dimensional surfaces. And we're going to talk more about that in some examples that we do have that are not made up. Like I mentioned, this idea of creating foregrounds and backgrounds does translate over into pottery, just not as well. Here we have Niobid painters example. So we have not everyone on the same level here. Obviously, there's someone laying on the ground. He used rocks. This is not an actual crack. I mean, there are cracks in this, but this is an actual rock that these gods and goddesses are standing on. Whereas other people are in front of those rocks and not standing on them and in the lower ground area. So a little bit more dynamic compositional choices being used in pottery. And there's also paintings, not just on pottery, but in tombs, is wall frescoes. So this is a fresco from a tomb called the Tomb of the Diver. in the necropolis at Paestum, Italy. This theme is going to be used by the Romans as well, but it shows a landscape, not just flatness. There's a background happening. Is this as illustrated as those panel paintings would have been? No. This is very pared down, simplistic, but it shows water, a tree. I know this was their trees. You notice this is what all of their trees look like. It's just twigs with some branches. And he's diving off of a diving board into a pool. It's kind of supposed to be symbolic of plunging from this life into the next, which is good for a tune. It fits this theme. Now, moving on to late classical. We're doing okay. I'm skipping some stuff and talking really fast, but we're doing okay. Late classical happens in 338 BC, roughly, give or take a few years, when the Greek city-states are forced to give up their independence from themselves to the Macedonians. Macedonian being King Philip II, later on Alexander the Great. That is the late classical period. So they have lost control. We are slowly on the downhill of the climax here of Greece. It all starts here. Starting with sculpture, because of the political upheaval that this shift creates, there is a bit of an effect on art. You'll notice that happening throughout multiple cultures that we're going to be talking about in this course. You kind of already saw it with Egypt and Mesopotamia. If you remember when the kingdom of Kush took over Egypt, they changed some of the sculptures. But yeah, politics and religion generally are two big things that have a profound effect upon art that's being made. Meaning, what happens? Well, for one, the severe style or the serene facial expressions of the early classical period go bye-bye, and people start exuding emotion. Individuality is also going to be shown. There's not going to be your set ratios anymore. You're gonna branch out of that. So is this a good period? Is this a bad period? Like I mentioned, most art historians and historians alike consider this the decline of art. But if you like emotion and individuality, this is your thing. Also, realism still exists. Because there is no set formula, there's also a bit more competition in the art world. So we are going to be talking about specific artists that compete against each other for renown, I guess is the right word. One of those is Praxiteles. Praxiteles is known for incorporating sensuality and softness into his figures, which you can kind of see with Aphrodite. He also used a lot of S curves, you can also see here, with his compositional choices that tend to make S's. Something else happens with sculptures. They begin to be intended to be viewed from all sides. Yes, some of the sculptures we've talked about have been in the round, but you really only need to look at them from the front and you're good. You get the gist. The way these sculptors were creating their sculptures was for you to walk around to really grasp all of the angles together in order to get the full picture. So really intentionally in the round, whereas the others just, yeah, you really don't need to see them from all the other sides. Front's good enough. Praxiteles and some of these other artists from the high classical area, I say high classical, it's late classical. I like it though, so I'm gonna say no. Late classical era also introduced the concept of nudity for females. However, it is only used for goddesses. That'll change later, but at the beginning, it's only used for goddesses. She is nude, but she is still trying to be modest. She is trying to be shy, but also be welcoming at the same time. She has something happening with her body that makes the viewer think these things. What are some of the things you notice?
Well, of course, she's contrapposto.
She is contrapposto, yeah.
Her shoulder goes back, her body's
Yeah.
a little more shown off.
Yes. So they're showing off the nudity, but they're also doing something to cover it. Yes. It's still covering her. So there's modesty, but there's also brazen nudity here. So both juxtaposed. You don't see that from a lot of the earlier sculptures. That jar and towel were intentional. This is a copy, but the original also intended that as well. Once again, to encourage viewers to look all the way around. It also suggests what she was doing beforehand, which was taking a bath. Hence the jar of water and towel. And this thing, that's to hold her together because this is a copy. Good question. That's so she doesn't break apart. Another Praxiteles, this is Hermes and the infant Dionysus. Hermes being this guy, Dionysus being the baby. Hermes takes care of baby Dionysus and hands him off to someone else to raise him. But Dionysus was a baby at one point, later on becomes the god of wine and partying. But yes, once again, an S curve, once again, a bit of a softness, more so, well, I mean, the body itself looks very soft, but there's also a softness and a tenderness in the interaction that is happening here. They recognize each other's existence. There's not a separate happening. They're together. And also a baby. We haven't looked at any other babies. And he actually looks like a baby. Later on, some babies won't look like babies. But yeah. Sculpus was another sculptor from that time. We don't have any of his statues left, unfortunately. He was known for his dreamy gazes on all of his sculptures' faces and creating intense emotional realism, meaning if he wanted someone to look like they were gazing off into space, he could do that. So definite emotion, but like I said, we don't have any of his stuff left. He did supposedly create the sculptures on the mausoleum at Halicarnassus, which is one of the non-existent wonders of the world. If you're interested in that, you can watch that video later, which covers all of the 8 wonders of the world and talks about which ones are still in existence. Heads up, there's only one. And we've already looked at it, so a bit of a spoiler there. Some people believe that this is similar to what Scopus's sculptures looked like, though. This is a grave stele. Scopus said he did full in the round sculptures, though not like this. This is a relief sculpture. In this sculpture, though, there is a clear distinction between living and dead, whereas the last stele we looked at, you couldn't really tell who was alive and who was dead. They were the same. The dead person being the one that is looking straight out at us, the young man. And the living people being the ones that are crying. The young boy, the dog is even crying, sad puppy. And the father is also saddened from his son's passage. So actual emotions, an emotional theme, an emotional story, they aren't trying to hide it. They're trying to emphasize it. Later on, the Hellenistic period will get even better at that. But this is kind of transitioning to it. But yeah, most likely died in either a hunting accident or a war, but he is a hunter that was, well, he died before his father. His father is saddened and in this image contemplating what happened, like why did I outlive my son, kind of thing. And yeah, sad puppy. Also, animal in art, showing emotion. Haven't seen that either. Lysippus is another sculptor from the period. He won great renown with Alexander the Great. He did all of Alexander's busts, made a lot of money off of it. And he introduces a new canon. Instead of the 1:7 ratio for heads in proportion to body, he goes with 1/8, which is technically more correct than Polyclitus's 1/7 proportion. 1/8 the proportion. And here is the scraper.
So in Olympic Games, oftentimes these athletes would scrape the oil and sweat and dirt off of their body with a tool. And that is what he is doing. He is scraping. He is reaching out to you. You can walk all the way around him from different angles. You see different things happening. Also, re-emphasizing that idea that these sculptures are meant to be viewed from multiple angles. Lysippus, another one of his. This is Heracles. However, this Heracles, he's just lifted up the world, which is the same exact subject matter. He literally just got done holding up the world. He is tired. He has the emotion of someone that is ready to be done with his day. He is tired from having just held up the world for Apollo while he fetched that apple. So very different. Also, once again, another one that you're supposed to look all the way around. This is intentional. He is leaning on his belongings because he's so tired he can't even stand anymore. He is extraordinarily muscular. That's on purpose. This was positioned in a bathhouse. Bathhouses were originally gyms. It was in a gym to encourage those training in the gym to work hard, to be muscular as well. So definitely not serene. For the first time, we have someone that actually looks the way they should look after doing the task that they just did. Well, I mean, not the first time, but this is a definite exaggerated version of it. Another Lysippus, this is not the actual one. Alexander the Great requested Lysippus to do a full heroic nude of him because, yeah, that's what rulers did. Unfortunately, the full heroic nude statue for this one is also lost, and this is a copy of one of the busts, just like Pericles. But we think this might be what it looked like. So maybe Alexander the Great looked like this, maybe not, who knows. He does look very young. Of course, Alexander the Great dies in his 30s. He doesn't get very old. He was in a heroic position. Most think in the same position as Polyclitus' spear bearer or the Zeus hurling the thunderbolt statue. So a heroic, triumphant pose to show off the fact that he was a warrior and a leader. But like I said, we don't have it anymore. Other things that were being made, mosaics. We're going to be talking about mosaics again when we get to Rome. This is part of the Pella mosaics. But I'm going to talk more. Oh, no, this is a pebble mosaic. Early mosaics were made of colored rocks and stuck into concrete or other sticky materials and let dry. This one's made of pebble. So we have shadow happening, depth, there is a foreground, there is a background. These are techniques that they stole from those wood panel paintings and tried to translate over into mosaics. We have the mosaics, they're stone. We don't have the wood panels, they're wood. It is signed by the artist that made it, Gnosis. This is another example of artists really wanting to make sure they made their stamp and people know who made it. Just like a lot of the previous sculptures that we've mentioned, they have the actual artist's name attached to them. Another image of that same scene from Pella. A mural painting that we do have. This one's from a tomb. This is an interesting painting that it's hard to read, but here's Hades, and he's carrying off Persephone into the underworld. If you know that story, good. If you don't, you're fine. He steals Persephone, and they're in his chariot. Persephone has a fearful face on her. Hades is kind of looking back to make sure she's not gonna like escape him. He's looking at her. But the interesting thing is the shadow under his arm. I know his armpit, that's the interesting part. And the details to those shadows that help emphasize the idea of volume. So we know that the Greeks know how to show space. A lot of people make the mistake of thinking that it's not until the Renaissance that we really understand how to show depth and dimension in art. But it happened before then. It's just forgotten because the Middle Ages happened. And we're going to talk about that next week. But yeah, Battle of Issues, another one. This is a Tessera mosaic. Tessera is using small glass stones like a traditional mosaic is instead of pebbles. We're going to see more Tessera mosaics next week. It illustrates the battle between Alexander the Great and Darius III. There is foreshortening used. There's also emotional expressions. There's shading. There's a lot of detail happening, and there's a whole lot going on in this mosaic. Originally, people thought it was possibly done by a woman named Helen of Egypt. We don't know. It really just depends on who you're asking. Other people think it's done by this guy, Philoxenos of Eretria. We don't know who did it. But this is what's left of that mosaic, which once again is done in small glass tiles. Here's Alexander the Great on his horseback. He is not staring at us, not paying any attention to us. We are watching a narrative unfold. He is making direct eye contact with Darius III, who is fleeing from the battle, which actually does happen. Like Darius III flees from the battle in real life too. On his chariot. Interesting parts though, horse butt, foreshortening. First time foreshortening is used in art history on a horse butt. Other interesting thing is down here, there is a man who has fallen on the ground and he's holding his shield up to like protect him from other things happening. We can see his facial expression on the reflection of this shield. So very attentive to detail. We have them trying to figure out how to illustrate reflections on surfaces that are shiny, and his emotional expression is very fearful as well. I mean, he's on the ground, so. Yeah, a lot happening there. We also see the introduction of architectural feats of theaters. The original theater for the Greeks was used for plays and musicals. In Rome, they create not theaters for that purpose, but in Greece, they're made for plays, different purpose. And their theaters are semicircles that seated a bunch of people. This is Polyclitus the Younger's theater, possibly the nephew of Polyclitus, the canon guy. And eventually Corinthian capitals are created. I think you can tell the difference between an Ionic, Doric, and Corinthian. Corinthian columns are very elegant, exaggerated, over the top, which is a testament of the time. Corinthian columns are invented right before the Hellenistic period. They will become very popular during the Hellenistic period, which is all about over-exaggeration of everything. And if you're wondering what's happening here, it is acanthus leaves and tendrils of grass that form the actual capital itself. The Corinthian column does solve a lot of the building issues that Doric columns and Ionic columns presented, meaning you can view this from any side and be totally okay. You don't have to add like an extra section to it. And you don't have to follow those same mathematical proportions with this one either. It's very thin and slender, unlike Doric columns as well. So it's lightweight like the Ionic columns, but fixes the Ionic columns issue. Theodorus is the first example in art history of a tholos. A tholos is a round building. Tholuses were first used for temples. So instead of sticking with the rectangular temple plan, towards the end of the classical period and the beginning of the Hellenistic, they experiment with different shapes, this one being round. This is the tholos at Delphi, which it did use Doric columns, not Corinthian. And I'm trying to figure out, oh, this is what it looked like. It's what it used to look like, not what it looks like now. And the last thing we'll talk about today, and then I guess we can take a little bit of time tomorrow to talk about Hellenistic to finish it off. But it is the monument to Lysicrates, which is also in a tholis shape. It has embedded Corinthian columns, and this whole thing is not a building. Not a building. It is a pediment. Well, not a pediment, a pedestal. That's the word. It's a pedestal. At the top of this pedestal sat a trophy that Lysicrates won. It was bronze. It's not there anymore. This whole thing was made for a teeny trophy to sit on top. But it shows off that they are getting better at doing different shapes in architecture, even if it's just for silly things, like a trophy. Yeah, like I said, tomorrow we're going to pick up with Hellenistic. We aren't going to do all of this. I'll pick a couple of them to focus on. Because, yeah, this is a lot. And there's really only a few that you really need to grasp to get the whole gist of Hellenistic art. Tomorrow, you guys need to bring your textbooks. You're going to want them. And on Thursday, make sure you've read page 1 through 23 of the Emancipated Spectator that's on your modules section. So yeah, that's it for today. I know it was fast. I know. Eventually we'll get to a point where we can slow down. But it's not with Greek art because it's huge. More like next week. Next week we can slow down because there's not as much next week. Yeah. Have a good day, guys. I will see you tomorrow, Grace.
See ya. Thank you for class.